Good afternoon, Zoomers, Millennials, Gen X, the few Boomers who may be watching my channel. Hope you're having a great afternoon out there. But today I'm joined by a wonderful couple of guests, including Mr. Hunger, who decided to pop in. And today is the anniversary, 2-year anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war. And what a time it's been. So many memes have come from this great conflict in the lands of Eastern Europe. But to help us break it down as former uh, Navy officer, Mr. Mandrel. So if you could, Mr. Mandrel, just give us a quick breakdown of where we started, because it's been a while since we gave an update as to the ongoings in Eastern Europe.
Sure. So, if you want me to start from the very top, this conflict, I think you could break into several phases. The first phase of the so called special military operation is the initial Russian invasion, in which Russia basically sent in several essentially unsupported armored forces, armored brigades, and you know made advances in the south in Kherson, got pretty close to Kiev, never quite seemed to take Chernihiv and all these little Ukrainian uh, like fortified cities, but basically had to withdraw from the northern parts of the initial SMO once they figured out that they didn't have enough manpower. And the Ukrainians, on the back of heels of that, decided to recapture Mykolaiv and and really go after Kherson and that region down south of the southeastern part of the Kherson Oblast and Crimea, and of course, simultaneous with that, there was another offensive in the east, which, of course, the that was over a lot of towns that we have heard the names over and over again. Places like Liman, places like Kramatorsk, Severodonetsk, Bakhmut, that and Lysychansk, all of that region. Um, and the Ukrainians were also successful at having another simultaneous offensive in the east as well as in the south. Um, the Russians basically decided, all right, that's it. We're gonna start over preparing for things. They made this gigantic defensive line in southern Crimea because the Ukrainian offensive in the south to either recapture Crimea or to operationally split the Russian forces in Donetsk from those in Crimea. This vaunted southern offensive was well telegraphed, and of course there was the famous release of classified information by a U.S. Navy Air National Guardsman, and we have reviewed those slides on a different stream on Charlemagne's channel if you want to check those out. But in any case, the real logistical um, thing to note with this conflict is how much aid is being given, where it's coming from, and who is providing it. Um, this has been a specialty of mine and something of particular autistic concern. Um, and really, many of the Ukrainian victories that we have seen in this conflict would not have been possible without Western aid of one kind or another being given. That's true of the offensives. That's true of the sinking of the Moskva. That's true of the sinking of several of these Russian uh, old Soviet amphibious landing ships that the NATO powers have really latched onto recently as kind of a coping mechanism. Um, all of the munitions that were used to hurt the Russian Black Sea Fleet, all of the information that's being provided. For example, the Ukrainians used a home built missile to sink the Moskva, but that targeting data was provided by American, um, maritime patrol intelligence aircraft and forwarded to the Ukrainians, and was claimed so in Western DoD affiliated sources. So it's not like it's not like the NATO powers have been idle or not doing anything, or that it's just been humanitarian aid, or that it's just been military aid of one section or another. It's been the providing to Ukraine of financial, military, humanitarian aid, uh, every last piece of possible kit, equipment, spare parts, ammunition, boots, clothing, sleeping bags, you name it, has been given to Ukraine in order to keep Ukraine in the fight indefinitely. And really, every single, as I keep saying, every single portion of the Ukrainian aid that comes in, there's other things to be said about it too, because the aid always seems to come after it's required, right? The one thing that is notable at this conflict is that NATO, in its desire to spin up this coalition of the willing, almost, if you want to use a 1990s term, has been really to create a these aid capable people and nations. And the problem with this approach is that it just takes too long. The aid gets there after it was needed, right? F-16s were needed prior to the Ukrainian spring offensive. Um, Now they're being given. Now the Ukrainians are being trained. I'm being told through some media sources that F-16s now have pilots that have completed their training or close to completing their training. And this is a consistent problem for the NATO side: is the arming, equipping, funding, and supplying in general of the Ukrainian forces. Really, what you could say with aid as well is every single piece of military capability is intended to increase capabilities that Ukraine had lost through attrition already, which is in the case of the Ukrainian Navy especially, or they're just trying to give them something that they didn't have capability whatsoever before, right? Ukraine had very limited precision guided munitions capabilities prior to the invasion, mostly old Soviet, ballistic missiles like Tochka and and things like that. Um, but with the giving of things like HIMARS, of Patriot, um, etc., and all of these capabilities are just increasing Ukraine's capabilities as Ukraine is fighting. Um, which is interesting because I think there is something to be said, especially with the precision guided missiles, especially with things like um, unmanned surface vessels, which have been used to harass the Russian Black Sea Fleet. All of these things are intended to give Ukraine capability that it lost or that it didn't have before. And I think it's a fascinating point of to look at how this is how a sea power fights versus how a land power fights. Russia is not historically a sea power. Its navy is 50 years old in some cases. A lot of the craft that NATO is bragging about sinking are old Soviet assets. Who knows what state of readiness they're actually in after 50 years of degradation and rust. Um, and they have to be replaced by Russia in any case. And this is really also another pattern of the aid being given to Ukraine, as we've consistently seen, which is everything that's been given is mostly ex-Cold War era equipment and some new stuff on top of it. So really, that's how that whole situation has played out.
And kind of give us a recap of where we are right now, um, kind of where we started when this whole thing started, as you said, with those armored columns. This thing started out very poorly for Russia in the beginning because they were using very idiotic tactics, such as marching armored columns completely unprotected on their flanks without any infantry, armored personnel, air cover. And that's why the Ukrainians were able to use javelins so effectively at the beginning of this war. And the media was constantly bragging about how Russians were being, their tanks were being depleted, if we remember this narrative before. And that was true. Maybe I'm not sure exactly why Putin decided to do that, but that was a very poor tactic he used in not
Ah,
protecting his armored columns.
so this is where we can already engage in some. Um, I'm not going to say revision, but in some updating of our thinking of what exactly the game plan is in 2022 when Russia initially initiates this special military operation. What exactly was the game plan with this? Well, the game plan was okay. You send in some armored columns with mechanized infantry. They don't send in nearly enough men. They send in a couple 200,000 or so. Um, they as you said, they sent them in largely unsupported along major highways. And I think in hindsight, it's fairly clear that the Russians, first of all, didn't really expect the Ukrainians to fight. I think that the Russians underestimated the amount of Western military aid post 2014, post Maidan, and also the training and consolidation of control of the Zelensky regime. The the interesting thing about um, that though is a how far the Russians actually got with how little they had, and also as you said, the unsupported nature of these attacks. Like these attacks were not, in my opinion, made because um, this was supposed to conquer all of Ukraine. It, maybe you could have said initially this was about Donetsk. This was about getting some kind of water access for the Crimea and forcing a political change by sending in special forces into into Kiev. Sorry, I have to pronounce it Kiev and not Kiev. But yeah, so it seems to me that really this war was started for very limited goals, and the lack of commitment of forces on behalf of Russia when really Russia did have the military capability and the active duty forces to invade properly in 2022. It makes it seem like this was a political decision, and really that political decision was based off of several misconceptions.
No, yeah, like you said, it was a political decision. I think Foresight kind of tells us this right. And it was kind of based on Putin's mindset of like, Russians and Ukrainians are brothers, right, from the old Soviet days. And like he still kind of believed this. He didn't really understand like how far, the Victoria Nuland, like CIA, US influence had pretty much like taken Ukraine since 2014 and before that the Orange Revolution, kind of instilling this anti-Russia mainstream narrative in Ukraine, especially in the elite class of Ukraine. And we also saw this with the decision, right? Because, like, in the very beginning of the war, he did use some aircraft to bomb airports and strategic targets, but it wasn't a strategic shock and awe campaign like we would have done in Iraq or any other country we decided to go to war with, right? Because Russia does have the air power and missiles to utterly cripple infrastructure of a country. He chose not to do that, which makes me think that this whole invasion originally was probably just a pressure campaign to get Zelensky to resign, to try to reduce that pressure, uh, for him to join NATO, something like that. And then it kind of like was like, well, shit, I didn't realize Victoria Nuland's influence got this deep. So it's like, well, now we got to protect the Russians in the East. So now we got to actually do war for real, was his mindset as we kind of
I mean,
moved on.
there's a couple interesting facets to that, and I can remember the week of February 2024. It's seared into my mind. You know that for the first 2 weeks of the war, it was very crazy, and a lot of things were happening. There were two very interesting things that were happening. I can remember distinctly from the first few days of the war. One was the bombing of Odessa, where the Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet was basically taken out of action. Literally within the first week or two of the war, like the Black Sea Fleet saw no action whatsoever, and they resorted to laying mines to block potential Russian landing ships from landing in Odessa and Nikolaev in those areas. So I mean, that was, you can definitely say that wasn't shock and awe, but taking out the enemy navy in the first week of the war is, I mean, it's a pretty big deal, first of all. And second of all, the big thing that happened, the big we can look back on it now, like Mandrill said, like we can revise our initial assumptions now that it's been so long and more information has come out at the time. People forget the entire battle of Gostomo Airport, or Gostomo, or whatever it's
Hostimo,
called.
Hostimo Airport.
Gostomo. That entire incident, when the Russian Air Force and VDV, Russian paratroopers, seized the airport within the first 6 hours of the war and fought, a 4-day campaign defending this captured Ukrainian airport that was literally about 10 kilometers outside of Kiev. And you see these giant Russian columns, storming across Belarus on the western side of the Dnieper River, because people also forget about that Russia invaded Ukraine from the western side of the Dnieper River by stationing troops in Belarus, and that those troops were rushed to relieve the paratroopers at Gostomo, who held out for about 5-6 days against Ukrainian counterattacks at the airport. I mean, that's definitely a shock and awe. When the enemy captures an airport 10 kilometers from your capital city out of nowhere within the first week of the war. So that can tell you a couple things. One, Putin wasn't really concerned about the capture of territory in the north. I think in the south it was a much different campaign in a much different situation. But in the north, with the Kiev operation, you can definitely see that the elements of shock and awe in that sense, and that it wasn't concerned about territory; it was concerned about a pressure campaign, like you said. And going back to Putin's humanitarianism, the Russian military never bombed Ukrainian barracks. They never bombed Ukrainian bases or manpower staging areas, because they predicted a more complete collapse, as what happened in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, when the governor of Kherson region basically fled to Russia, and the entire chain of command collapsed in the south. And that was why the Russians were able to take over the southern Ukraine so quickly.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note like the actual discussion of bombing of barracks and using precision guided missiles and this sort of thing to attack enemy training infrastructure behind the lines. In fact, well behind the lines. The first time that I ever heard of an actual Ukrainian military barracks being bombed was by, I think it was by a Caliber or Iskander missile, and basically this was in the first like several weeks or several months, when after the initial invasion, Ukraine basically is receiving foreign volunteers, and Russia basically says, "Nope, we're not doing this," and just decides to bomb the barracks where the foreign volunteer battalions were supposed to be trained at and organized at. So I thought that was a very useful uh, signal. Who knows how effective it was in the long term, but I thought that like if you want to prevent enemies from across the globe from signing up in their tens of thousands to go fight for your enemy, well then obviously you very early and very often use one missile, which is a price tag of a couple $1 million essentially, and you blow up their barracks and say with the message that you're not, if you, this is what awaits you basically. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, that was a Kinjal missile, and it was launched against
Yeah, at the
Western
Reddit
Ukraine.
battalion. Yeah.
Yes, the Reddit battalion. Yeah, those guys.
There were rumors that Kinjal missile hit like a NATO base. That they were again, this is rumors. We still don't have all the information about this, but that there were NATO officers, building up the training ground for the future Ukrainian military and reserve forces in Western Ukraine. I can't remember the name of the town, but that was the first record of a Kinzhal missile being used in the war. And it did terrify the West very briefly.
Yeah, the other thing that I think we can look at in hindsight too, is the use, especially early on, of both terror as well as I mean, I guess you could say this is just both propaganda, but of both terror and extreme levels of like ecstatic emotion, right? And what I'm talking about with that is the ghost of Kiev and the myth of Snake Island, right? These two simultaneous Ukrainian war myths that popped up in the first week, and became memes in and of themselves, right? Obviously, you've got the Russian warship, go fuck yourself. It's so ridiculous in hindsight, but people legitimately took these incidences, or I shouldn't even say incidences, because they weren't exactly real. They didn't happen the way that the propaganda said they did, but um,
Media
people,
operations.
yeah, they're basically psyops, right? They're and people took them absolutely seriously and at face value. Like, every single person who was pro-Ukrainian today probably believes 100% in the ghost of Kiev or in Snake Island, in the first several weeks of the war, right? So I think that's very fascinating from the perspective of using these sorts of little you know information ops to gain support for a conflict that has nothing to do with the people.
No, most famously, the most famous person to believe Magos to Kiev was actually Adam Kinzinger from Illinois, who famously believed Sam Hyde was bombing 6 million Russians. But that was a fun
Washington
episode.
State.
If people remember that
Oh,
whole
that was
ordeal
so
on
good.
Twitter,
That
I
was
mean
so good.
that alone shows you the power of psyops right there. That dumb Congress people will fucking believe a Sam Hyde meme
He can't
right
keep
there.
getting away with this.
He really truly can't, man. No, the whole thing with Snake Island too. Like, I mean, this shows you the power of like U.S. intelligence to propagate these ops. That's the one thing they're really good at, is narrative shaping. The West has always been really good at shaping. Now, winning the war is a different question on a tactic and strategic level, and we can get into that. But on an operational propaganda level, the U.S. is world class still with the State Department. And we've seen that with their CIA buddies and assets in Ukraine. I think that's kind of put that really on show that they are still a formidable propaganda outlet when they need to be, of course. Because again, they're run by a bunch of retards, but again, they're still really good at it.
No, indeed, and it's fascinating that Putin mentioned that in the Tucker interview, where Tucker was asking him, "Why don't you release the information about the attack on Nord Stream?" And he was like, "What's the point? No one's going to believe us anyway. The West is controlled by media corporations and financial institutions. So it's interesting that Russia didn't even try to wage a propaganda war. I mean, like even in the months leading up to the start of the conflict. Like there was no propaganda campaign in Russia. Everyone was going about their normal lives. It just kind of like came out of nowhere for the vast majority of people. Most people had swallowed the nothing ever happens. And the people, even people who observed, what was going on in Ukraine at that time, were like, oh, nothing ever happens. Like this is unprecedented. And it really was. It really was unprecedented. It was a huge happening that people kind of like have gotten used to in the 2 years that have passed since.
No, it really like destroyed Francis Fukuyama's thesis, I think, permanently. Of the post like Cold War, McDonald's neoliberalism hegemony forever, basically.
No two
McDonald's
countries with the
world peace.
McDonald's
Yeah,
ever went to
yeah.
war.
Although that was kind of disproven with the Bosnian War, but that's a separate tangent. Because Ukraine and Russia had McDonald's at the beginning of this war. Oh yeah, that was a whole another thing. If we remember that, the West decided to retaliate by removing all of these Western companies from Russia, and it was like they banned Pornhub, McDonald's, KFC, and it's like we're making them stronger, guys, by banning all of these Western influenced. Do you remember that whole campaign? That was our punishment.
Yeah, we're gonna prevent you from eating McNasties. Yeah, that's a total punishment. We're gonna restrict your intake of possible seed oils. Yeah, that's a great move, guys.
Honestly, in all fairness, I think the banning of Instagram and certain porn sites was a huge detriment to the Russian economy. There's a lot of there's a lot of Eastern European women out there, that I won't say more than that.
No, no, no. This is no, no. It's a detriment to the GDP. GDP line will not go up, but your TFR rate will.
Very true.
So true. And another thing about the media narrative, especially in the West, at the beginning of this war, was every day it was like Russia lost like 6,000 tanks because of one Ukrainian gunner or some tactic Russia was using that was so incompetent, right? So at the same time, we get this dualistic narrative of they're so incompetent they can't even capture a small town in the east, right? However, at the same time, they're this massive threat that requires endless funding from the U.S. superpower, and please give us more money and more tanks because we're losing so much at the same time, right? And again, I think that narrative's been disproven with time because it's like, again, Russia's running out of tanks, Russia's running out of artillery. At the very beginning of the war to 2023, I say that narrative was still strong and going very well. It's kind of really been disproven, especially with Bakhmut. I think Bakhmut kind of like destroyed most of that narrative forever. Because again, Russia has really shown us they do have war capacity, and their industrial base, especially the weapons department in the Urals and central Russia, is very much active. And as far as I know, the factories producing missiles, tanks, and artillery shells are going 24/7, 7 days a week. And U.S. production can't even meet Ukraine's needs for like a month or something. So they're quite shell hungry at this point, and that's why we've seen Russia increasingly dominate the space.
Well, funny you should mention artillery shells. So I was watching this guy. I can't remember his name now, but he is the Army's assistant director for logistics or something. Assistant secretary of the Army for strategic procurement. Anyway, but this guy did an interview, and it's available on YouTube that you can see. It's about an hour and a half long or so, and he basically was saying, and this is a Biden administration, public official, and he was essentially saying, "Look, we've brought American shell production at the single plant that manufactures 155 millimeter ammo from its 14,000 a month shell capacity to 28,000 a month, to its full capacity, 28,000 shells a month." Okay, that's fine. They're also starting shell factories. They're constructing new factories, 2 new ones, which have basically the same capacity as the other ones. So you've got 28,000 times by 3, so 84,000 shells a month. If you divide that by 30, oops, so what did I say, 84,000? Yeah, so if you So that's like literally a 3,000 shells a month, basically 2,800 shells a month. The Ukrainians are already, with all NATO sources, from what I've been seeing, firing about 2,000 rounds of 155 or 2,000 rounds of artillery shells a day. And then that's with all of the Soviet artillery. That's with all of the American 155 artillery and all of that.
If I recall, didn't they double it? Like it used to be 14,000 shells, and since 2022, it's been doubled to 28,000.
Yes, they did that because that factory was not at 100% capacity or production capacity. So you're literally just saying, okay, well, we still have the tools, we still have all of the necessary like materials on site to spin this factory up to full production. We just, for budgetary reasons or whatever, we just leave it at 50% capacity because it's peacetime production. And so basically they brought that single factory, the single factory that produces 155 millimeter ammo, conventional ammo, up to full production of 28,000 per month. And they're now increasing production by building 2 additional factories, which have roughly the same production capacity as well. So like I was actually very shocked that America only had one factory that produced the artillery ammunition for its conventional land forces. That was pretty shocking to me. Um, and I mean, it's good that they've got, or they're creating redundancy now, but
The
the
problem is it's 2.5 years too late.
right, it's 2.5 years too late to help Ukraine, which is part of the reason why the you've got America has had to rely on Europe to help this fight. Um, it's why America needs 155 ammunition from Israel. It's why America needs 155 ammunition from South Korea. It's why they need it from all of these other various sources in Europe, which produce their own version of 155 millimeter or have it in stockpile already. And it's why the several European countries like Italy, like France, like Germany have all been giving Spain and other places have all been giving um, artillery pieces that are either ex Cold War or slated surplus or what have you that are 155 millimeter capable. Um, in addition to that, you have all of the ex-Soviet stuff, which this was a huge news item this week actually because the Czechs found 300,000 artillery shells just lying in storage somewhere that they'd forgotten about. Ex-Soviet. This is like becoming a meme in and of itself, as we're just going to find random Soviet, you know, hardware lying in some random place. But and so they found these extra shells and they're giving it to Ukraine. Um, but that's only 300,000, right? 300,000 is a lot. It's like, the sorry, I'm doing a little autism here. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So just for reference, the 84,000 possible shells that America is giving to is producing is about a million, just over a million. And you're so like the Czechs have basically in a one-off one-time deal given Ukraine about 4 months worth of shells essentially. um, and probably that's all in mostly ex-Soviet caliber, which is the stuff that they really need because the more they fire it, the less that's available that they have, right? They started out with sizable stockpiles of it, but their production capacity is limited, of course. So
Yeah, another big thing. I think people genuinely underestimate how large the scale of demilitarization has happened in Europe. I mean, Ukraine before the war had the second largest Soviet army, post-Soviet army in Europe. They had, 1,500 tanks. They had hundreds of aircraft carriers. They had hundreds of aircraft, not carriers. They had, thousands of Soviet vehicles, thousands of artillery pieces, millions of 152 millimeter shells. And that army had basically ceased to exist in the first year and a half. You only get to see the flood of Western equipment. You only get to see the flood of Western equipment in the beginning of 2023, and by that time, they had run out of like their Soviet stockpile. And another thing, Poland had given away all of its MiG 29s. The Czech Republic had given away all of its T-64s. Many of these post-Soviet states had just emptied their entire stockpile of Soviet weaponry to feed into Ukraine, and they're still waiting to this day for American and Western replacements, which haven't come and will take years of production to get to, because America has to replenish its own stockpiles and its own weapons before it can ever satisfy European customers. So that's a huge strategic victory, and gives Russia a lot of time to deal with.
yeah, I would agree. I would say probably not as much time as we would hope for, or Putin would hope for, I should say. Um, and the reason why I say that is because now you're starting to see signaling of the Europeans realizing that they don't have enough ammunition in storage, and you're getting to the point now where you have to choose between, do I provide arms and equipment and ammo to Ukraine, or do I dig my own stockpiles for my individual country below where what we need to defend ourselves with. And that's a decision that a responsible responsible statesman would not be willing to do. I'm sure some of them, especially in Eastern Europe, might be willing to do that. I'm sure the United States may be willing to do that, especially with cluster munitions and things that we consider to be banned. But like we gave the Ukrainians cluster munitions, even though like we don't like cluster munitions, we think they should be banned, etc. But we gave it to them anyway because we just don't have the 155 millimeter ammo to give them. So that's the only type of shell that we have available that they can use, basically. So of course, well, at least in sufficient quantity, that's not going to dig down our stocks, right? Because we don't like to use cluster munitions, so we're just going to give it to them because then it's off our hands and it's not sitting in storage somewhere, doing nothing. And like that's the real reason of why they're doing this. But yeah, like the ammo situation is very fascinating to me. Like I as I'm sure all of your audience members understand, like this is like a hobby of mine. And really, like the problem for the West, right, is first the nature of the conflict and the war, and because it's been so artillery focused, and Western countries, unlike the Soviets and Russia post Soviet times, which is focused on artillery, they find this very difficult, and it really is proving the limitations of air power to a certain degree. Now that you have precision guided missiles, which are very, very good at destroying aircraft, right? It's difficult to fly aircraft into a zone, at least where you have like an operational radar and a missile that is connected to it. To use planes in the way that we've seen them used in previous conflicts, where you get behind the enemy's forward line of contact, behind their front lines, you use them to, like in World War II, disrupt their industry, etc. Right? It seems now that precision guided missiles have taken on that role, and aircraft kind of have gone to the wayside a little bit. So that's also an interesting development.
No, I think we've also seen this war that like you can very much repurpose a bunch of these older bombs, especially from the World War II and like Cold War era. And like most famously, Russia has done this with the Fab 500 bombs they used for their old Soviet bombers, essentially turning them into like glided ammunition that they've used fairly successfully, especially recently in eastern
Yes,
Ukraine.
yes, that's also another interesting development, because this was supposedly a huge advantage that Western military aviation had over the Russians, especially with bombs. The glide bombs are not new, right? The Americans basically have a similar system called JDAM, which is you're taking a general bomb or a GB bomb of that series, right? Which is a very, very, like, there's nothing special with it. Oh, god damn it. Why am I fucking hate political calls. I'm sorry. I'm getting these fucking calls all the time now. It's very annoying. But um anyway,
Many such cases.
yeah, so where was I? Oh yeah, so the glide bomb technology is not new. It is something that was developed during and out of the Cold War. Um but now the Russians basically have found a way to engineer their own equivalent of this, right? So this is a sizable uh, innovation in Russian hardware. One of the major strengths of Russia and its technology is the fact that most of its stuff is very cheap. It's designed to cost, right? It's not fast. It's not like the top tier, best of the line stuff. Like the Su-24 and 25 series bombers are not particularly flashy, but they do have them in sufficient quantities, and they're rugged and they're relatively cheap compared to the A-10 Warthog. So really, and I think they're a bit slower actually, but anyway, the whole point of being able to use the glide bomb technology is now you're saying, okay, this particular plane, which is a bomber, right? It's a fighter bomber in that old classic terminology, right? Or a dive bomber, right? It's used in air to ground attack roll, and now you're allowing it to not have to fly directly over its intended target to bomb it, right? That's what you're doing by having a standoff munition, right? You're just taking a normal bomb, attaching a couple of fins on it, putting a basic, gyroscope on it so it understands, pitch, roll, etc., right? And you're not really giving it any additional like motor or jet propulsion or anything. You're just letting it's called a glide bomb because that's literally what it does. You just let it glide. And so if you are at a certain elevation, you can have your plane, say 30,000 feet or whatever, you can drop this glide bomb, and you can it is as long as you like. I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but like you can easily imagine like, okay, I understand where the target is, I know how far away it is, and so your little bomb understands basic things of like, okay, where is it, how far is it, what direction, and so it can kind of glide itself into position of where it needs to be in order to explode, right, on target. So the fact that the Russians have this means that their old Soviet bomber force, which was like kind of expected by the West to get attrited in a Western versus Russian fight pretty quickly, or just wouldn't be used at all because it'd be just too dangerous to send these old bombers into action. They just get shot down by air defense systems and all of that. Well, now you can actually stay outside of air defense range and actually start attacking the forward line of contact or just behind it, right? That's the major innovation of what these glide bomb systems are intended to do. Is they're supposed to give you some standoff attack capability. So the fact that the Russians have this now is a huge deal, and we've seen them use Fab 500 and Fab 1500 glide bombs to great effect in the combat footage. Like they use them all the time now. So yeah.
And the conversion to make them a glide bomb is fairly cheap. I don't know the exact cost in my mind, but like it's way cheaper than one of our JDAM bombs, which have like an active GPS in the bomb to tell it where to go specifically on the map.
Yeah,
I think all you do is put like a tail fin on these bombs to glide it.
Yeah, they're very cheap. And I mean, even JDAMs are still cheaper than a precision guided missile. So, it gives you precision with a very inexpensive upgrade to these general purpose bombs.
And the good thing about these bombs is they pack a fucking punch, as we've seen in the footage. These things are great at destroying fortifications, as we like to say. Especially in these, especially the Donetsk and Lugansk front, which have been, fortified since 2014. Again, we need to remember these places are as fortified as, the DMZ in North Korea. With, fortresses and, strategic points, right? Since 2014. So, the best way to destroy fortified positions is with aircraft bombs. Because they're much bigger, they pack a bigger punch than artillery by itself. Because artillery is still fairly small, it can do significant damage, but if you want to destroy, knock out a fortification like a bunker, a strong point that's reinforced with concrete and steel and all these things, you really need aircraft, caliber ammunition to significantly destroy it.
Yeah, and also having the precision helps as well. Artillery is still accurate and with the advent of drones as spotters in artillery warfare, I'm sure it makes them more accurate, but how many artillery shells do you you can see the combat footage of people firing artillery shells at trenches. Not all of them are going to hit as a direct hit, right? It is somewhat imprecise compared to a glide or precision guided munition. So if you can get a bomb, which is substantially larger than an artillery shell, and you can get it to have a direct hit inside of a trench, right? The trench is going to be vaporized and everything inside it's going to be gone. So these things are very useful.
Yeah, I mean the effect of artillery. There's many effects to artillery. I mean it is a small munition, but we can observe this from World War I or World War II. The effect of artillery is shock value. It has a huge psychological effect on troops and especially people who are stuck in trenches. The shock waves of these artillery shells is enormous and can definitely it's a morale destroyer. It destroys the morale of the troops in the trenches, and that's why discipline is extremely important. The bombs themselves, I mean, you can't compare a 155 millimeter shell to a 500 kilogram bomb. I mean, this is like comparing, I don't know, a shotgun to a nuke. It will level anything it touches within like a half kilometer radius.
Well, and I'm going to contest that point there, Hunker. So our good buddy Jimmy Thomas has a series of videos explaining the combat arms and how all of the composition of modern armies go together. And he basically was explaining that the artillery section of the combat arms in combined arms warfare does most of the damage, right? Most of the casualties are from artillery, which this comes up to another bit of retrospective point here, which is the rate of casualties. And I always bring up the artillery point as when I talk about the casualties, because even if Russia is attacking for substantial portions of these wars, even if it's taking like lopsided casualty ratios for the first year or so, realistically, who's going to do more casualties? The person who has less firepower or the person who has more firepower? Right? The answer is the person who has more firepower is usually going to deal more casualties. There are key exceptions to that, notably if they're engaged in attacking. Attackers require somewhere between 2 and 3 at the local level, 2 to 3 times numerical superiority of whatever the defending forces are as a general ratio. So, but even still, like if you have artillery, which is, twice as many shells being fired per day, 3 times as many shells being fired per day, 5 or 6 or 7 times as many shells being fired per day than the Ukrainians, like over time, losses are going to start to mount. And that's even before we get into the drone discussion, because I have seen articles in the mainstream complaining that the Russians have a 7-to-1 numerical superiority in drones. And I'm sure that also that doesn't include FPV drones. There's also surveillance stuff as well. But the point remains is that a surveillance drone can be converted to carry a 60 millimeter or 80 millimeter mortar or a grenade and dropped on to somebody's trench, right? So we've absolutely seen that from the combat footage. So it's not like it's just simply saying like, okay, you're taking drones and artillery, and who's got more of them, who's got more firepower, who's got more tanks, who's got more armored vehicles, who's got more, maybe not infantry, but who's got more men on the ground, really, who's got the logistics to actually support the conflict continuing, right? And it appears that Russia, despite whatever logistical difficulties that it has, does it have logistical capability to support that.
No, another thing you mentioned with the drones, right, is that like their allies given them like has shown us the value of like cheap but good military tech, right? With these like flying lawnmowers, right, which have like a 60 to 80 pound warhead. They just like are one and done pilot. They've used to destroy like artillery emplacements and disable tanks and all this other shit.
Yeah,
like the utility of these things.
They're very useful, right? And I've talked to this issue many times, but really, when you start having munitions that are precise, that are relatively long range, that have electro-optical systems attached to them, like it becomes very difficult to defend against and really to hide when everything on the battlefield has a camera or a radar system or some sort of passive passive radar recognition system. It becomes almost impossible for somebody to hide. There's very little fog of war at that point. I'm not still saying that fog of war doesn't exist, but it becomes much easier than in previous eras to identify and to find and fix where your enemy is. And of course, once he's found and fixed, then he can be destroyed. So, and of course, the era of gigantism is basically in warfare is basically over. Right now, you're going to start to see a regression back to building military assets with cost in mind, and with the assumption that you're building these things to get blown up, and so you have to build them with the assumption that somewhere along the line they're going to get destroyed. So you probably shouldn't invest too much into a gigantic, like, unstoppable warfare system.
Man, Joe, I don't know if you know this account, Big Surge on Twitter.
Yeah, I follow him, I think.
He's a very good account. He had this tweet where he was talking about I believe it was a tweet, maybe it was an interview, where he was talking about artillery versus drones. And the problem with drone warfare is electronic warfare. You know, the West has been talking about, we can't supply Ukraine 155 millimeter shells. We'll just give them tens of thousands of drones instead, and they're just as good. The problem with that is that all of these things can be countered with electronic warfare, and on a cost to cost basis, you know, a shell just it doesn't compare. Artillery is very cheap, and there are ways to counter artillery. There's counter battery radars and so on, but you can't take down a shell. You know, you can't bring down a shell with radio waves or electronic means. And so do you believe artillery will be a thing of the past? Because I don't believe so.
I would say no. I think that the other effect of drones is to, at least with spotting drones, and it makes artillery more deadly because it makes it easier to use, to spot your enemy first, and then also to give corrections to artillery coordinates. So I would imagine that drones enhance the lethality of artillery rather than supplant it. Mortars might be a different story, because mortars, you might say, okay, a drone is better to use than a mortar, but I somewhat disagree with that. It might be, at least in terms of trench warfare, but I don't think a lot of these weapons are going away.
No, I very much agree. This war has shown us the very much utility of like mass cheap weapons, and not this like Western idea, especially after the Cold War in the 1990s in Iraq, that like all you need is like these like super expensive glide bombs to win every single war.
Or
And
special forces. Everything will be special forces.
We could send in the Green
Yeah,
Fire War by themselves.
Go ahead,
And that's
go ahead,
been
man.
quite disproven, I think, honestly.
Tech. Yeah, high tech, high end. Yeah.
But
really, if I may, so like the other interesting angle for this is the discussion of attrition, right? And the West loves to brag about how it's sunk multiple Soviet era warships, how it loves to brag about how it's, how satisfying it is to thump a bunch of like BMPs and T-72s and stuff. And I find all of that interesting, and I guess, from a Russian perspective, it's probably like, demoralizing to see your tanks constantly get shot at and blown up. But the fascinating thing is, one, is this not a case of a simple numbers game? Like if Russia has more tanks and Ukraine has anti-tank weapons provided to them by the West, in addition to tanks and artillery and all of that stuff of their own, wouldn't you not see that there are more Russian tank casualties? Because Russia, to a tank, is like, okay, I'm going to commit it in situations where where the Ukrainians totally wouldn't commit that particular asset. And it's also kind of like the fighter ace problem of World War II, right? Whereas the Germans have these fighter aces, which have, massive amounts of kills, but really that's more of a phenomenon of just simply being outnumbered than anything, as much as anything else. And I would imagine the same thing is true for the Russians. If you have more tanks, okay, you're probably going to use them more often, and so they're going to get blown up more. That's my basic assumption here. And the other thing from an attrition perspective too is like we said, a lot of this stuff is Cold War surplus. T-55s, T-62s, these are things that the West loves to make fun of Russia for using. I'm not so sure. Like the entire point of using these drones is to take these incredibly like Charlemagne got a wonderful picture of one of his streams of this drone carrying like an obviously old like bomb, like which is totally rusted out. It's this modern sleek plastic drone carrying this bomb around it, and I thought that was a perfect image of what modern warfare has now become, which is using extremely old and aging assets, giving them new life and using them for a slightly different purpose after their expiration date. And the same thing goes with T-55s and T-62s as well, right? In a more static warfare, you can use exceptionally aging tanks as direct fire support weapons platforms. They're not intended to be used as tank on tank warfare, and even from an armored vehicles perspective, you can still use a T-55 or a T-62. Their weapons will penetrate the armor of a Ukrainian BMP or an M113 or whatever. So it's a question of using it in the proper place and at the proper time. And from Russia's point of view, all of these assets, especially T-55s, T-62s, and a lot of T-72s, I would imagine, are so incredibly ancient that losing them is not as big of a deal as the West might perceive, right? Why wouldn't you, I mean, it's the same thing on the West side too, right? You're giving all of these like Bradleys that you're intending to replace anyway, which the U.S. Army has never been fully satisfied with that platform, but it's still capable. And so what exactly is the point here? You're just saying, okay, well, we're just taking a bunch of Cold War assets and throwing them on Ukraine and smashing them against each other. Well, if that's what you're doing, right, then why shouldn't Russia do the same thing? And Russia can afford to lose, thousands of T-72s. It can afford to lose thousands of BMPs. Even the Western, which is really funny because the Western media has this information of how many tanks that Russia actually has and how many like armored platforms that Russia has prior to the war, but they also like are ecstatic about like the destruction of these tanks. I just this is something that I get very like I don't know, I'm very perplexed by this. It's almost
Yeah.
like the Holden Blood Feast meme is like, Lindsey Graham is saying like, oh God, I just need to see I just need to see T-72s get wrecked in the Fulda Gap one last time before I die.
Yeah, no, I mean it speaks to it speaks to how Russia has stewarded its Soviet legacy much better than many other countries, especially Ukraine. The fact that this is so extremely cost effective. And like the T-62, T-64 it was the workhorse of the Ukrainian military in the first year of the war, and it's not going to be a T-72, it's not going to be a T-80 or a T-90, but it's extremely effective mobile artillery, and it serves that purpose extremely well, and protects troops. But and on that point, that it's Ukraine has been using its new Western toys very sparingly, and you're seeing this in the counterattacks. You're seeing this in the counterattacks around Zaporozhye. You saw this in that very specific units of the Ukrainian military, especially guys like Azov and the highly trained Western troops. They get the best equipment. They get the Bradleys. They get the M1 Abrams. And you don't see this all across the front. And they basically serve as firemen, putting out fires when the Russians are advancing too quickly or too forcefully. So this is not standard across the entire Ukrainian military, and these are just very much prestige weapons that that Ukraine is very careful to husband, and unless it's in very desperate situations.
So I
No,
just
yeah, it's like the Ukrainian cinematic universe, right? With how they operate the war, right? Especially with with Western equipment, right? It's like we're gonna use all this like really expensive Western equipment, and like basically rush the Russian lines because we have to recapture Crimea, right? Otherwise, the West isn't gonna give us more money for the next time we need money, right? And that's how they've been
Yes.
operating the whole war, basically.
So I just sent you I sent you this document, which was a news document from pre-war, right, showing you how much equipment both Ukraine and Russia have. And I love to look at this whenever I see signaling about how many tanks or how many armored vehicles Russia is losing. Like, you're like, Russia lost as many tanks as it had starting the conflict with. No, it has 20,000 in deep storage, and it has started to increase its own production anyway and refurbishment of these old tanks. So,
I
like a
mean,
T 50.
the Soviet legacy, the Soviet legacy was so huge that the Russians could afford to, just store up tens of thousands of tanks, T-62s, C-64s, T-72s, and have no use for them whatsoever until something like this happens.
Yeah, it's also very interesting too because like the Soviet legacy, even in the West, is very, very muted. Right, the West post Cold War, not only did it deindustrialize, but the 20 years of conflicts that it has partaken in has ensured that, other than its active duty forces, its reserve forces are not nearly sufficient. Um, like you can talk all you want about the qualitative differences of these weapons items between the West and the Soviets, but the West's strength is in its active duty military and not in its deep reserve. Whereas Russia, obviously, because it's a country that doesn't need to be at war always, can afford to have a deep level reserve and keep all of these assets in storage and not actually use them. Um, the other interesting thing is the oh yeah, there we go. There is the pre-war strengths comparatively of both militaries. So you can see Russia had 2750 roughly, and this isn't like an official number or anything. This is like a news number. This is a news outlet sort, I think, from ABC. But um, the you can see that Ukraine's basically they have equal tank forces at the beginning of the war, roughly speaking, right? With all of the ones in storage that Ukraine has, and plus Ukraine's active duty tanks, and all of the ones that Russia has in storage is like 20,000, 21,000 tanks. Okay, fine. Russia has lost 3,000 tanks in Ukraine. It still has 18,000 in deep storage. It still has production capability for these assets and refurbishment ability for all of these other ones. So even if some of those 18,000 are just simply hangar queens, where for those who don't know, a hangar queen in military terms it's a military asset, usually an aircraft, hence the term hangar, which basically just sits there in a hangar and is used as spare parts for other assets. Um, so it's like a spare parts source. But like some of these assets in deep reserve could be hangar queens, but I would assume that a lot of them are not. And after you bringing them online and doing basic maintenance and refurbishment, I'm sure they're perfectly usable for what their platforms are. Um,
They can be refurbished in about 2 months, or even less in some cases.
mhm.
And on the other side of this, I mean, compare Russia's like reserve of like T-62s to the American M60. I mean, the M60, it was a Vietnam era tank that was replaced by the M1 Abrams, in the 80s. But America had thousands of these tanks by the end of 1992, and many of them were in storage. They had literal thousands of these tanks that had already been replaced by the superior Abrams. And what did they do with it? They weren't even sold off. They were given away as foreign military aid to countries like Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, all of its client allies,
Yes, Greece.
across the world.
Yeah, Greece
Greece,
also. Yeah, which is
yeah,
interesting because
that
go
go
ahead.
ahead. That would have been a huge reserve of of hardware and equipment that would have been available if there was more foresight.
Yes, and the same thing you could say with Leopard ones in Europe and in Germany specifically. Like they've been able to scrounge up like 130. I mean, at the most they'll get is probably a couple hundred Leopard ones, but that's not nearly enough for what Ukraine needs. That's just enough to reconstitute Ukrainian armored forces after attrition, basically, and that's basically it. Um, well, but the reason they're looking at M60 now, and I'm starting to notice this little pattern that you see with gay signaling. I literally just go into my Microsoft Edge feed, look at what the headlines are telling me, and if they're looking at a piece of equipment, they'll usually say like they'll present it like, oh hey, here's this piece of military equipment, M60, Cold War legacy tank, blah 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 blah, right? All of whatever headlines, whatever they say. But then they'll switch over to like, could the M60 help Ukraine, or something like this, or and then M60, this is now a requirement for Ukraine, right? So they'll do this like shift in strategy, and you've seen this for a couple different pieces of equipment now. You've seen it with Abrams tanks and Western other Western tanks like the Leopard, the Challenger 2. You've seen it for F-16s. You've seen it for other stuff, right? For artillery and things. So it's very interesting to watch. But like right, but M60 is interesting as well because it uses 105 millimeter, which is the same caliber that Leopard 1 uses. It's the same caliber that some of the older variants of the M1 Abrams tanks use, right? So it really just shows you like, okay, well, we've got this asset, we've got the ammo for it. Let's just give it to the Ukrainians now, since they need more armor. But of course, as I keep mentioning, all of this aid is all too little, too late. The strategic initiative throughout this war has, at least logistically, has always been on Russia's side. And the reason why this is because the Gay got flat-footed, and basically every single time that there's like a crisis in Ukraine or Ukraine is running out of equipment, they end up giving them more equipment, but it's not enough to shift the conflict or the numerical balance of the conflict in Ukraine's favor.
No, and they also tell Ukraine to
and
do stupid shit like, go ahead and rush the fortified Russian lines so you can retake Crimea, so we have a victory, right? Like stupid shit like that. Hold on to Avdiivka, even though the town is surrounded, because you must hold on to all territory physically possible, right?
No, see, here's where I disagree about Avdiivka, right? Avdiivka is this, in my opinion, is a situation in which, and if you want to pull up the a map of Ukraine so I can explain,
Yeah.
I think the Jimmy Thomas map would do well for this purpose. But so basically, Avdiivka there's a rail hub just east of Avdiivka, and there's a rail line that runs from northeast to southwest, so basically from Donetsk to Crimea. And the major thing that the Russians have difficulty in dealing with, at least from a NATO perspective, is their logistics. And their logistics is ultimately very heavily reliant on rail. And the NATO forces in Ukraine have used precision-guided munitions to disrupt these logistical supply lines, like bridges and that sort of thing, to undermine Russian logistical capability and to make it a pain. So if Russia gets this rail line, this rail hub in Avdiivka opened up, the Ukrainians don't want to let Avdiivka go for two reasons. One, because it allows you to shell Donetsk, and that's propaganda value, both from Russia and Ukraine's perspective. But also, more importantly, the logistical perspective is you can't afford to let Avdiivka go, because after Avdiivka is gotten rid of, you lose the rail hub east of it. And then the Russians, there's two major highways running roughly parallel throughout from Donetsk city all the way to Zaporizhia and Dnipro cities. So this is where we're going to start getting into big arrow offensive theory here. Logistically, that allows you the ability to transfer logistical supplies from Crimea, from Donetsk region to Crimea, as long as the Russians have the Ukrainians outside. The forward line of contact is like 20 miles away, so the rail lines and rail hubs are outside of conventional tube and rocket artillery range. So basically the Ukrainians are in this weird position with Avdiivka because A, it's part of their original defensive fortifications belt. It's also part of this. Oh yeah, that one would work too. Hunker. It's also part of this. This like I said, the fortification system. It's got like fairly substantial. Yeah, here's my map of my plan here. So it's got this. So it's part of this like Severodonetsk and defensive line going up to Liman, this forest belt as well. So the Ukrainians, they can't really afford to let it go because there's not a lot of defensible terrain in the south for them to hang on to. And logistically, you can see these, like I've had pretty much these two arrows in red on the center are basically on the two highways that come out from Donetsk towards Dnipro and Zaporizhia. And there are rail hubs in Pokrovsk, which, if you can see in kind of the center of that top triangle right there, that's where Pokrovsk is, the top red triangle. So it's basically you're just frog jumping to the next rail hub, basically. And from Russia's point of view here, strategically, now needs to be the shattering of Ukrainian defensive lines and the capture of the south of Ukraine, because really now that the Gay has actually kind of shot itself in the foot, in my opinion. They because as a naval power, they have focused on preventing Russian capture of Odessa, but now Russia understands that the only way to take Odessa is by land, and you have to cross the Dnieper to get there. And since the destruction of the bridge of the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson, you have to get over these two bridges in Dnipro and Zaporizhia city proper. So that's why all of these reasons are why I think that Russia needed to capture Ukraine on a strategic level, and Ukraine needed to defend Avdiivka on a strategic level. And since it's the only last piece of defensible territory, well, Ukraine's going to hold it to basically the last man, and they're going to. Obviously, they tried to keep it going until the last second. So with that, also to notice the media signaling, you have the mainstream media signaling of increased Russian casualties and, oh, Russia's lost this many men in this many days, blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. What that tells me is that, and because of the nature of the weather in Ukraine, you've got a very limited time window to actually conduct some sort of summer or spring offensive. And so Russia needs to consolidate its position by the rail hub near Avdiivka before March, basically. It needs to capture Avdiivka, consolidate sometime in mid-March and maybe late March, so that it has the entirety of the summer after the spring rail season to make a forward push and attempt to capture Pokrovsk before the end of the year. Pokrovsk being the limited objective, which has a rail hub, and and getting across the Dnipro by the capture of Dnipro or Zaporizhia cities is the long objective, right? Not the short objective, the long objective. So from my point of view, it looks like you've got the necessity to capture Avdiivka before March, basically. And so Russia might have said, okay, well, we're willing to take additional casualties to expedite this process of capturing Avdiivka. So in my opinion, that's to put two and two together and to take all of these little pieces of information. That's probably what's happening.
No, I think I'll retract what I said about Avdiivka. Avdiivka was important. I think what I meant to say was these, like, symbolic targets that hold no value, right? So, like, to hold Bakhmut, even though it's, like, surrounded and you're losing tons of troops and equipment, right? Or to, like, launch an offensive against, like, the Russian lines for, like, one village in, like, Zaporizhia, right? Things like this that, like, basically fund the Ukrainian cinematic universe, are completely pointless on the tactical and strategic level. Right.
I mean, I see your point, but I'm very wary of falling into the other extreme of like the Ukrainians have no strategic thought whatsoever, and they're just sending human meat waves, and some of that might be true. I mean, the Zaporozhye Crimea offensive was a total failure, an example of that. But especially when it comes to the Donbass, I think they know what they're doing, and I think they know where their strong points are and how important some of these areas are. I mean, Ukraine was very much exhausted after Bakhmut, but so were the Russians. We had the whole drama with the Wagner guys, and we didn't see Russia go on a very large offensive, until from May till October. The Russians didn't go on the offensive because they were recovering from Bakhmut. They suffered, high casualties, not as high as the Ukrainians, but they suffered high casualties, and they knew that the Ukrainians were preparing their own counteroffensive. The race to Tokmak and Crimea. But I think the Ukrainians are not. I don't think they're retarded. I think these strong points in the Donbass are a key to their defense.
Yeah,
And on Mandrel's point as well, I think Prokrovsk is a very, very important hub. It's the central Donbass rail hub. Going west to east. But I
right.
don't. It's quite far from the current front lines. I want to say it's like, I don't know, 50, 60 kilometers away. That's quite a big distance. And my prediction is, and we have a kind of a cigar slam of our own running along. I think the Russians are going to handle Slovyansk and Kramatorsk before they handle the rest of Donbass. And to do that, they kind of need Kupiansk and places like Izium as well. So my prediction was a Kharkov
So,
offensive, not to
so,
actually take
so,
Kharkov, but in Kharkov Oblast.
right, in the region, yes, and of course, what you're saying is okay. So, the Russians are going to attempt to reduce the salient that they've got to the west of like the Slovyansk line of cities, right there, that triple line of cities. I always forget their names, but
Yeah,
yes. And that makes perfect sense to me, and um, like on my map, I do log that as being I do have a red arrow near there, but that's like a minor area to me. That's not like where the major point of effort should be. In my opinion, any sort of Russian offensive movement in that area will be to basically to pin the Ukrainians in place and to force them, because the Russians know that that's where the defensible terrain is. So the Ukrainians are going to kind of feel obligated to hold it. They won't want to let it go easy. So the Russians will pin them in place, prevent the transfer of forces from the north to protect the south when the Russians actually start to push forward towards Pokrovsk. I think that is the intention of any sort of offensive maneuvering in that region in the Liman or sorry, not Liman, the Kursk region or whatever you want to call it. Sorry, a lot of these cities.
Kharkov.
Kharkov, yes, thank you. A lot of these cities' names are yeah. Anyway, so basically, in the Kharkov region, you just pin them in place, basically, and then you prevent them from transferring their reserves, and then you hit them really where it hurts in Pokrovsk. Um, I actually don't think that a 50-kilometer advance is actually that far. There's not a whole lot of defensible terrain in between Bakhmut and or not Bakhmut, sorry, in between like Avdiivka and Donetsk city proper and Pokrovsk. There's like a couple rivers. There's like one specific defensive position that we all probably should get to familiarize ourselves with the names of. Like there's these little if I can find it again, there it is. There's like this little town of Kurakova, which also has a rail hub apparently. That's by a lake called the Vodcha River. Sorry, not a lake. It's a river,
Yeah.
but anyway, so that's like there's a river that basically makes a reverse L shape. So like the town of Zoriana, Selidova, right, all of these Novoselivka, Kalinova, Karlivka, all of these little places which are in this little L shape. Oh yeah, Ternopil or whatever, and Andriivka, all of these little places on the possible line of Russian advance, we probably should familiar with ourselves with them just briefly so that we can make sure that if there is offensive movement, we'll recognize the names of these places and understand what's happening. But really,
God created geography for Americans to learn. God created war for Americans to learn geography.
Indeed, yeah. Otherwise, I would never be able to pronounce Slavic town names.
That is so ironically true, and you don't even know how true that statement actually is.
But anyway, so like Pokrovsk is the juicy target of the next year, I would say, if I was from an operational and tactical perspective, as well as from a military perspective of smacking the Ukrainian army. So you've got this dynamic, right, that the Russians have, I think, on a message basis, where you've proven to the Ukrainians, I can defend against anything you throw at me. I've stabilized my position here. You cannot take anything from me anymore, right? You've the high water mark of the Ukrainian resistance is basically over with the recapture of Kherson and Bakhmut. You retook Bakhmut and Liman, but we basically took all of that territory back the hard way. So any town that you defend, we can take the hard way when we're willing to pay the price and casualties and equipment to take it. Every single loss that you take matters far more for you than a loss matters for us. And so now I think that if the Russians actually wanted to, you got to break the spirit and the will of the Ukrainian army. And the way that you do that is by actually attacking. Now, I'm assuming that the Russians actually have mobilized sufficient forces to do this. So everything is dependent on logistics. But yeah,
that's probably true, and I definitely agree with that. I would just say one thing, and this is not a counter argument, but I would say if the Russians were intent on taking Prokrovsk, they would have to deal with Vuhledar first, and Vuhledar is the hinge on the southern axis of Donetsk, and which prevents what the Russians have shown us is that they love these semi encirclements. They're always attacking on multiple angles. And so there's a straight highway from Donetsk to Prokrovsk, but without that southern axis of Vuhledar, I don't see them making that would be a very hard slog, and the Russians are very casualty averse in that sense. So there's quite a few fortifications left.
I've thought of that, right? So the N15 highway towards Kurakova is how you would take Vuhledar, right? You don't take Vuhledar head on like the Russians have been trying to take it. You take it from behind, right? You take the three.
100%.
I see what you're saying with taking it by three sides and three, a triple encirclement or a double envelopment, if you will, if you want to. That's the technical military term. But the way that you double envelop it is by actually launching attacks and taking Kurakova, right? So then you could have Kurakova, and then you could take Boho, Yelenka, and Antonivka, and Novomikhailivka in the southwestern direction from Donetsk, right? So yeah, I did think of this when I was thinking about this plan here. But if I was to take Vuhledar, that's how I would choose to take it. And also from the perspective of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk and that whole defensive line right there. So you've already got the Russians. I think they've captured Horlivka, if I remember correctly. They've got Bakhmut now. Taking Pokrovsk is actually the best possible solution because there is a road that leads up to Konstantinivka, right? So there you have this line of cities that extend from the south of this Liman forest belt area, starting with Slavyansk, heading south to Kramatorsk, and then Druzhivka, and then Konstantinivka in the very south of that little defensive line. So
yeah,
if you took
Konstantinivka is
another.
Sorry, just briefly. Konstantinivka is another Bakhmut. It's a very fortified place, and it's on a very very important road access.
I'm going to share a
Right.
map so people know what we're talking about, because most people
Yes.
don't know geography very well.
Yeah.
So let me
I'm
just share a map of what we're talking. We're talking about this area right here.
Yes. So Konstantinivka, right? That's the southern portion of that fortress, and of course, the way that you take a fortress is by maneuver. And how do you take Konstantinivka? The way that the Russians seem to prefer to take it, well, you by double envelopment. So, of course, if you're going to take, and why I think Pokrovsk is important, is because by taking Pokrovsk, you have outflanked the entire defensive line. That entire city belt is basically rendered useless because you've basically outflanked it by attacking the essentially this is you're making a frontal attack on the center of their line. You've already attrited their forces in Avdiivka, and so now you can take Pokrovsk and outflank. You're making a separation basically. It's not a very wide or deep one, um, but you could. It is still size substantial, and by taking Pokrovsk, it allows you a rail hub. It allows you the access to that particular road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinivka and running through Chazov Yar. And so you could, by taking Pokrovsk, you could actually you're outflanking Konstantinivka and making this whole defensive city belt moot, thus saving you casualties of having to take them frontally. And if you take Konstantinivka, right, you're forcing Ukraine to defend it, basically. So it'll end up being just another Bakhmut, like we said, where they can't afford to let it go, even though they're in a disadvantageous position of being double enveloped. So that's why I think Pokrovsk is, for all of those reasons, the best target to go for this coming year.
No, and it also allows them to basically outflank this fortified belt right here. These like three cities: Kramatorsk, Sloviansk,
Right,
Konstantinivka. Because if you advance this way and you capture this railway and highway hub right here, you're basically in their rear and on the flank. And that's the most advantageous position if you want to attack our strategic point, is occupy the flank in their rear, because you can disrupt their supply lines, reinforcements, and obviously the most fortified area is going to be facing towards the front, not the back. So it's just a win-win to
Yeah.
take this strategic point right here, because the roads just line up so perfectly right here.
This is also why the Ukraine Kharkov offensive was such a huge strategic victory, and some people want to downplay that, but no, it was 100% a huge strategic victory, because if the Russians had still held on to Izium and Liman, and after they had captured, while they captured Bakhmut as well, if they had held those three places, it would have been game over for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But I mean, like I said, the Ukrainians are not retarded. They know what they're doing, and the Kharkov offensive was a very big strategic victory. It basically saved Sloviansk from being encircled from the north, and the Bakhmut operation is slowly inching its way to encircling it from the south.
Right. So I will give you a bit of credit here because, and I can see why you think that there will be two offensives, one in the north and one in the south. And I understand that what's the best way to take a fortification? Well, from both sides, right? From both ends, as I like to say. And so what that describes is a Russian advance attacking Sloviansk, and then if they can take Pokrovsk, then they can take Konstantinivka from three sides, and then just basically roll up the entire fortress belt. Now, so I can see what you mean. I just don't think that. Sorry, my gut just tells me that the Russian forces are just going to reduce this salient here, pin the Ukrainians in place, and then take Pokrovsk and do a single envelopment. That's the strategy that I would prefer to do, just because you go where the terrain is open and where you can effectively use your mobile forces and your armor, which Russia has and has in greater quantities than Ukraine. So you really have to use your assets and maximize your assets of what you have and what your enemy doesn't have. And by attacking in the direction that I've listed on that map by my red arrows, that's basically what you're doing. You're maximizing your best assets, the assets that you have in plentiful quantity, which are your tanks and your armor, and you're basically using those assets to get you the results that you want, against an enemy which is of course notably deficient in armor assets.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, while it's fun to play armchair general, the Russian military and the Russian general staff have other plans that we will never know about. I mean, we can look at a map, we can see what sounds logical or what looks likely, but we don't know what, even to this day, even 2 years after the start of the war. Going back to the actual topic, we don't really know what Russia's war aims really are. I mean, we have an inkling of it. I mean, they want the four oblasts. That's taken care of. They had the referendums in late 2022, but we don't really know what the Russians view as their end game in Ukraine, and that's what makes military predictions and offensive predictions so difficult, because they have strategic ambiguity, and whereas the West does not, and Ukraine definitely does not. They announced their counteroffensive 5 months before they launched it, which is completely retarded.
Yeah, I mean, well, they weren't helped by a breach in security on the gays part, but yeah, I think that, and to counter your point here, just very briefly, I think that yeah, well, the Russian mindset is different than a Western one, and so their prioritization of what they consider important and what they think needs to be taken care of might slightly differ from us, especially in terms of maneuver warfare. But I'm just looking at the geography, and I think that's the juiciest target on the map for all sorts of reasons. So that is the logical place of why they should attack there.
And the benefit of capturing Pokrovsk is like it increases the distance between the nearest Ukrainian artillery and Donetsk city itself, so they can't really shell Russian rear areas, supply hubs, and like Russian civilians basically in Donetsk. So it has a double value in terms of morale boost as well.
It has a quadruple value. It has a quadruple value. And Pokrovsk, if you notice on the map I gave you, with all the red arrows, it has an actual rail hub in it. So Pokrovsk, you're just like I said, you've got a rail hub in Pokrovsk. You have a rail hub in east of Avdiivka, and so you have the logistical capability now. You've completed the it allows you to take Ugledar and allows you to complete this rail line that runs southwest from Donetsk to Crimea, thus freeing up logistical capability for the forces down there, and that basically it's the right spot to do. That's where I would attack. That's the logical place where they should attack. But anyway,
I think the best predictor of what city is next is where Zelensky has visited most recently. He has this funny habit of whatever city he visits, it just falls within like 2-3 months later.
Yeah, it's like the kiss of death. I have full confidence in my military forces here defending Bakhmut.
That's gotta be so demoralizing. Like, oh god, the kiss of death has arrived.
The Rat King is here. Bakhmut has fallen.
Yes, the cokehead of Kiev has arrived at their position to increase our morale, which means the end is very near.
I would just be like Peter Hitchens, like, it's so over. It's over.
Reed Kadita in the audience brought up a really good point. I know it's semantics, but Boris's intervention is a significant event to take note of at the start of the war.
Oh, of course. Of course.
Yeah, Bojo, as we like to call, man, it's been a while since we talked about Bojo. If in case you don't know, at the very beginning of the war in 2020 and 2023, Russia and Ukraine did sit in for peace talks in Turkey. Erdogan was breaking those peace talks, and they had gotten a peace proposal discussed and approved, though we don't know the full specifics of the peace proposal. Bojo basically flew down and told the cokehead that, like, hey, listen, if you stay in the war longer, we'll give you more money and more weapons, and those talks fell apart. And we're still here 2 years later, so good job, Bojo.
I think the deal was I think the deal is the Russians get to keep the Donbass, or at least parts of the
It was
Donbass.
Donbass and Crimea, I think was the deal.
Of course, the Donbass, Crimea, and Ukraine enshrines neutrality in its constitution, which it already was. Ukraine had a neutral constitution post-Soviet Union, but America and Victoria Nuland decided to ignore that.
I wonder why. Very personal ethnic grudges going on there, but let's be on the topic for the
Many such
stream.
cases.
Also, like, what the West has done by, like, basically provoking these disagreements and provoking Russia is, like, they're basically increasing the line at which Russia's going to take territory from Ukraine, because now it's inevitable at this point. They're going to take territory. The, like, NATO goal of, like, total 1991 borders is never going to happen. So basically, what's being decided at this point, each day the war is prolonged by the West, is, like, how much territory Russia is going to demand and, like, conquer, basically, from the Ukrainian state, whatever's left of it. And depending on the results of the 2020 election, either that will come sooner or later, but at some point, that's what's being debated here. And time is basically the factor that's going to dictate territorial gains from the Russian side here. If you guys agree with my point there.
I do think the 2024 election is gonna play a role in how Ukraine ends. For better or worse.
I would agree. I would say that 2024 is incredibly important because with the spinning up of Western munitions production, it would increase the amount of available munitions that can be sent to Ukraine. So and that's true in all NATO countries, not just the United States. All major NATO countries which have given weapons and ammo and provided them to Ukraine have signaled that their intention and their ability to increase munitions production, especially in artillery. So all of that is going to free up additional logistics requirements for Ukraine. Which means that basically Putin has to has now got to finish his business pretty quickly, I would say. I think that there's a risk from Putin's point of view of letting this war drag on too long. And so if he's got the manpower, if he's got the resources, if he's got the artillery, if he's got the tanks, he's got to use them. And he's got to defeat the Ukrainian army in the field. And the way that you do that is by outflanking their defensive positions, forcing them out of those defensive positions. And basically the way that he wins is by taking Odessa and by making Ukraine a landlocked rump state. That's the condition of victory here. And if you can do that by defeating the Ukrainian army in Donetsk and Luhansk, rather than having to fight them in every single city of Ukraine, that's superior, right? So defeating them in that region, and getting this is just long-term thinking of what I would do if I was Putin, right? Spend the next year just crushing the Ukrainian army in Donetsk and Luhansk, and then being able to have relatively unopposed victories in taking other sections of Ukrainian territory. Like that's what conceivably might happen.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and I think this definitely shows in the casualty numbers. We're never going to have completely accurate estimates, but I had a tweet where I gave the example of in the first 4 years in the first 4 years of not the German-Soviet war, and basically in the first 4 years of the Eastern Front, the Germans lost about 3.5 million men within 4 years. But however, in the last 6 months of the war, they lost 1.5 million men, and so that is an enormous the increase in casualties is non-linear. The more morale collapses, the less equipment you have, the less the worst quality of troops you have, the casualty rates increase more towards the end of conflicts than they do at the start of them, actually. And I think Russia is very close to getting to that point where, the casualties are just overwhelming. And Avdiivka might be a sign of
Where's
that.
sorry? What is the source for that 1.5 million casualty figure that you have?
I believe I think I found it on Wikipedia, but I think it sources from a history book. But yeah, no,
Oh, okay.
within in the last 6 months of the war, the German casualties were absolutely staggering. More than they had ever had in the 4 years on the Eastern Front.
No, definitely. As you like get into a less like strategic position and you lose fortified areas, like your army's going to suffer far more casualties in an increasing rate, and we're seeing that in Ukraine. But with that said, gentlemen, I've really enjoyed our discussion, but I think I'm going to start wrapping the stream up now. Is there any, Raging Manager, any sources you recommend people to look up if they're interested in learning more about the dynamics of weapon shipments going on in Ukraine so they have a more realistic notion of what's going on?
Sure. So I just look, and this does take a bit of legwork and reading on your own. But you can just look at what press releases get put out. Like the lazy option, which is what I do, is just look at my MSM feed on Microsoft Edge and just look at what the regime is signaling that they want to give, because then they always say that they give it, and then they always eventually inevitably tell you in what kind of quantity. um, and you can always just look up Wikipedia. Oryx is still a decent source if you're looking for what kinds of equipment are being given and who is giving them. It doesn't always give you a quantity. Like, for example, Italy gave 60 artillery pieces in 155 millimeter, but they didn't log the quantity of it because that wasn't included in like a press release, but Wikipedia had it. So like that's just one example of like, okay, if you're looking for a more specific quantity, it is possible to find it, but you do have to dig for it. And like, unfortunately, Wikipedia, even though it's not friendly, is still has better, more refined data than Oryx does. Like, I don't like Oryx at all. But anyway.
All right, with that being said, gentlemen, would you anything you'd like to shill? Any projects you got coming up? Any places the audience can follow you on?
Sure, you can follow my YouTube channel, my Substack, follow me on Twitter, Gab, all of the usual places. You can also check me out on the OGC channel and Substack and the affiliated places there as well. So yeah, check it out.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at HungerDye, DYE. Substack is kind of dead. I should bring that back. But you can find some of my guest appearances on a channel, a good friend of ours called Hitman. He's if you're interested in Middle Eastern history, then check out my streams with Hitman on YouTube.
Yeah, Hitman's a good channel too, so you should subscribe to him as well.
Definitely recommend. And if you did enjoy this live stream, please give my channel a like and subscribe, as I am putting out more good content out there, and I have some really epic stuff that you're going to watch coming on my channel very soon. But with that being said, gentlemen, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I really appreciate the conversation. Peace.